Who is Peter? Well, you will not be surprised that Peter is the author of 1 Peter and 2 Peter. He introduces his first letter just like this. He says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. His second letter, he says, Simon Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. No long explanation about who he is, no list of qualifications, because he doesn't see himself as a great leader or preacher first and foremost, and he was those things, but his identity is found in one thing. He follows Jesus. You know, we can learn a lot from that. Very often we're very keen to define ourselves, who we are. I do this for a living, I do that for a living, I have this qualification, I've preached here, I've done this, I've led that. Peter just says, I'm an apostle of Jesus, I'm a follower of Jesus. It's not about me, it's about him. Now, although he's known as Peter, that's not his correct name. His correct Jewish name is, of course, Simon. Jesus calls him Peter as a nickname, and it's a nickname that's stuck. And hey, Peter means rock, rocky. That's not a bad nickname. He was a fisherman whose life was changed the day that he met Jesus. He became a disciple. He was part of the group of the closest disciples and one of the founders and leaders of the church. When he first met Jesus, he was living in a place called Capernaum and appears to have been running a very successful fishing business. His house was large enough to give him a home to his brother Andrew. His wife's mother and his wife lived in that house, and Jesus, for a time, stayed in that house as well. So it must have been a sizable house. In fact, you can go see the ruins of it still today, and it's a sizable space. This is the house, by the way, where 4 men turned up one day and cut a hole in the roof to lower a paralysed man in so that Jesus could heal him. And they couldn't get in because there was a crowd. So this is a house where you can get a crowd. I hope Peter had good home insurance. Anyway, so the point being, he wasn't just a fisherman, he was a successful fisherman. He was not the sort of person whom just to drop your nets one day and follow Jesus would have been easy. He had a lot going on. But when Jesus said, follow me, he did exactly that. He dropped his nets, he followed Jesus. And it was Peter who first proclaimed that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus says to Peter, it's on this rock that my church will be built. This revelation of who Jesus is as the Christ. Now, some people have taken it to mean, because he nicknames Peter Rocky, that Jesus meant the church was going to be built on Peter. Now, that contradicts everything else we hear about the foundation of the church. And they've took this to mean the church was built on Peter. Peter is the first pope. No, Peter was not the first pope. He was one of the leaders of the early church, but by no means was he the leader of the early church. In fact, as we heard, he reports to James. But Peter was still a hugely significant figure. You couldn't tell the stories about Jesus without having Peter in the stories. So he was certainly a very prominent figure, and his letters would have been extremely significant to the church. It's Peter who spoke at Pentecost, gave the very first church sermon. Peter was the first who took the gospel to the Gentiles, having been told by God, don't call unclean what I have called clean. So Peter would blaze a trail, and Peter would follow Jesus to his death, and would be himself crucified. We can learn a lot from Peter, because Peter is quite a lot like us. He is one of those guys that it is extremely easy to relate to. As we read the stories of Jesus, we see Peter in the Gospels in all of his flaws. Now, I wonder sometimes, his flaws get pointed out a lot by John, and I wonder whether there's a little bit of something between them. But he does get pointed out all of his flaws, and we see that Peter is a far from perfect follower of Jesus. He makes mistakes. he makes some huge mistakes. He even denies knowing Jesus on the night of his arrest. He denies him 3 times. And boy, I tell you, he found that one hard to come back from until Jesus restored him. Listen, we can learn a lot from Peter, but I tell you, one of the greatest things we can learn from him is if you've let God down, if you've found it hard to get back on track, let me tell you, you are not the first person to experience that. You are in good company. But the key to this part of Peter's life is he allowed this to be a moment that brought him growth, not discouragement. So that when Jesus restored him, he was a different person. So that when the day of Pentecost came, he was ready to stand up and not deny Christ anymore, but proclaim him in front of loads of people. Peter was a Galilean, a northerner. Again, another reason we can relate to him. And just like every northern region, they had a reputation for independence and an energy that would often get them into trouble. Peter appears to embody this stereotype completely. He's brash, he acts without thinking, and boy, he was far from perfect. And as a result, we get the feeling that as imperfect followers of Jesus, we can understand Peter. We can relate to Peter. And despite his mistakes, despite having a personality that would get him into trouble, Peter is forgiven, he's restored, he's commissioned, and he helped change the world for Jesus. Learn that lesson. Jesus uses messed up people, and in his hands, messed up people can do what we cannot do alone.